Vampire the Masquerade. I can't say it was the most likely IP I would draw an affinity to later in life, but I owe it to the half-baked Troika Games RPG title Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, a game that changed my perspective, since I was a child, on vampires, on how cool they were, and a game that easily became one of my favorite RPGs ever, even a decade after it came out. So when ideas of a sequel started floating around ages ago and led absolutely nowhere, I wasn't quick to latch on. When more announcements, this time more official ones, would drop sometime in 2019, featuring some of the original legendary cast and some other big new ones, time would work eventually on me to dispel my concerns, as the thought of a sequel to the beloved vampire RPG that I enjoyed was a lofty endeavor, but one that I quite wanted. But Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, much like things inside of its world, weren't like they seemed. The game, after its initial announcement, would take form under developers Hardsuit Labs, but as time would pass, would have the project ripped away from them and given to another unlikely studio in the Chinese Room, largely behind walking atmospheric narrative games like Dear Esther and Amnesia. Delay after delay would plague the project, as would many more major changes, making the product we got in the end, which would launch October 25th, 2025, nothing like it was expected or even previously shown. Only Vampire the Masquerade in name, the sequel, Bloodlines 2, would fail to impress classic and new fans alike, struggling to sell even 200,000 copies before Paradox, the publisher behind the project, would admit that they were taking a $37 million write-down on the project and barely managed to even sell better than the first game initially when it sold the worse 20 years earlier. That's why we are covering a single-player RPG right now, as we cover the original company behind the first game, Troika Games, on the Death of a Game series, a series where we usually diagnose the largest contributing factors to a game or company's death or process of dying. Utilizing a timeline of events filled with clues and bits of evidence, this all culminates in a final deduction, every detective's grand moment to shine, where we crack the case for good and make sure you didn't miss any of the clues along the way. Stay tuned to the end of the episode for a clue on what the next case will be too. Without any more exposition, detectives, Vampire the Masquerade is calling me again, and this time, I'm an elder vampire apparently. Choose your clan, detectives, and let's storm Seattle and get to blood-sucking. The story begins with the purchasing of White Wolf, the company and brand behind the famous or infamous TRPG IP Vampire the Masquerade from the 90s. While Vampire the Masquerade has made its appearance into gaming before, including most famously for me and many others, with their genre-defining RPG Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which launched back in 2004, they didn't actually really build on the popularity on the back of that game, which launched fairly unfinished and lacking in some aspects until much later, developing a cult following that followed the title for decades, where jokes would echo that every time the game is mentioned, you must play through it again, with the next community patch dropped by WESP 5, a timely tradition for the holidays even. You can't convince me that Bloodlines isn't a holidays game, come on. Where to start though? I could dedicate a whole video to talking about the wonder that is Vampire the Masquerade, something I already pretty much did with my coverage of the company behind the RPG, Bloodlines, Troika Games. While it might seem like the story should start much later, and I shouldn't cover Bloodlines 1 should be covered because it was so impactful and memorable. We can't possibly understand the context of a sequel as well, and why it failed to impress its core and new audience if we don't understand the first game. Troika Games, though, the studio behind the game, was troubled. Check out my Death of a Game on them, but they had immense talent, and even when going head-to-head with Half-Life 2, one of the greatest rated and sold games ever, managed to impress people despite not being that competitive commercially. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is a joy to play, and I feel I'm qualified to talk about it. Not just because I'm a major fan, but because I was a non-fan of vampire stuff and Vampire the Masquerade in general, a part of the World of Darkness mythos, of course. That's right, VTMB brought me in and gave me fangs. I am naturally a big RPG fan, especially the more narrative-focused ones, with adventure RPGs being kind of like my favorite genre of all time. Vampire stuff for me always was kind of too campy, or too edgy. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines took this approach and gave you a more realistic world and just added this dark underbelly underneath it all, or over it. It was totally believable, and I was instantly transported to Seattle where the game takes place, eager to do every side quest and something that not even like Mass Effect as a series can make me do. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines in recent talk might seem a bit mythical, much like the vampires featured throughout it, but I'm here to dispel any of that nonsense surrounding the game. Sure, it had a poor launch, largely due to reasons I covered in my Death of the Game covering the game, but it did very much become a staple in the RPG community despite everything in the end. That might make its legacy or experiences feel kind of exaggerated, but in reality, I was one of those quick to dismiss the heaps of praise being thrown at the game, and then I went and experienced it. The game holds up. and story and writing wise, it's literally up there with the best written games ever. But you don't have to take my word or believe my hype. Chris Avellone, who would later be involved on the second title, would actually agree with this as well, objectively. And I take someone like That's Word, who made like 3 or 4 of the best story-told games himself and characters ever. And then we have to talk about the lip sync and the voice acting in VTMB. It's still one of the best I've ever seen in a game, and I mean like 20 years later, truthfully. And that ends up being a pretty big deal, as you will see later in the video when we cover the sequel. But without just buzzwording it up, I'll give you an example. There's a side quest in VTMB that literally spans the entire plot of the game, and it's deep enough on its own right to be part of the main plot or in a separate game. That's not counting the amount of different ways to approach what side content you do find, allowing you to talk your way through things, fuck your way through things, or fight, you know, the RPG or anime classics. But besides all of that, the world itself is just so much fun. You have these ancient vampire houses warring with each other while trying to keep up the masquerade or follow the rules they all set to keep from getting exterminated or causing too much fuzz. Each house is unique, and some are even based on physical deformities or uniquities, if you will. This allows for the player to customize their playstyle to a crazy level, having a huge impact in the game's story and even dialogue. Take playing a Malkavian, for example, a clan that can literally argue with a filing cabinet, flirt with the stop sign, or solve incredibly complex cases on accident. There's no middle ground, and it's fucking fantastic. That was laid within the dark and crude looking walls of ETMB, and it was a great debut of a world. But as I said, despite the success I referenced, which came much later, VTMB largely was uneventful at its launch, and would remain dormant as an IP even after it found success like a solid decade later, before we started hearing rumblings of a new title set in the same universe, or sequel to the first Bloodlines specifically. While there are a slew of Vampire the Masquerade games that would come post-2016, the one we're going to focus on, of course, for this episode is Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines' sequel, Bloodlines 2. After CCP, the developers behind the EVE Online MMORPG would offlift the WOD name and thus Vampire the Masquerade to Paradox in 2015. After failing to produce an MMORPG in that universe, Paradox would go full steam ahead on trying to create more Vampire the Masquerade games. Now, Paradox was largely a strategy game publisher and developer. Now they decided that they wanted a piece of the ever-growing TRPG realm with massive new IPs like Call of Cthulhu and bringing with it tons of dark plots, intrigue, and naturally the ever-growing titan that is Dungeons & Dragons. After Paradox's acquisition, Seattle-based developer Hardsuit Labs, behind Blacklight Retribution, would pitch Paradox, led by creative director Kai Cluny, Kara Ellison as a lead writer, and the former lead writer and character creator for the original Bloodlines game, Brian Mitsoda. Paradox was impressed by this pitch, a pitch even the famed video game developer Chris Avellone was brought to and a part of as well, helping bring some name recognition and authenticity to the project. But drama would strike the project early on after there would be some accusations concerning White Wolf, the company behind the World of Darkness name and IP, and lore links to neo-Nazi terroristic groups in real life. To be honest, I have no idea, of course, if these claims are ultimately true, but what we have seen don't necessarily look good. And I, of course, have a propensity to think that people are super cringe with politics in video games, meaning that why are they even bothered by them in the first place, or in this case, bothered by something meant to be seen negatively in most cases that's meant to reference something else. That being said, it can be hard for some people to tell the difference between a bad clan in a video game or a bad character, and good guys. But if we try too hard to censor such a thing, it's a losing battle, let's be honest. Kill the obviously bad ideas though, and maybe don't make actual references to the word neo-Nazi or say things like triggered for some cringe reason. Those kinda make you seem guilty. Anyway, all of this aside, this would lead to Paradox bending White Wolf over at the knee and disciplining them, no longer allowing them to run their own IP. During the same time as this kerfuffle, Chris Avellone would quietly depart the project before it being blasted on a loudspeaker for all to hear. Many were attributing it to a series of accusations that Chris would receive during the time, which were later recanted and largely discredited. However, according to Chris and other sources I have involved, Chris merely departed the project due to not renewing his contract or having it renewed. Later, Chris would remark a little bit about the situation, seemingly not being the biggest fan of the direction that the company had taken the game after, especially after having all of his contributions removed anyway. But Hardsuit Labs would continue on as the herald of ETMB 2, which would be sort of teased during February 25th, 2019, and then fully announced the next month, March 2019. As pitched, the game was showcased with the new cast of characters, with Brian Mitsoda front and center as a lead narrative designer, something he would later remark about being something that he wasn't necessarily totally into as more of a creative-focused creator than a leadership one. But Brian would state that Hardsuit Labs was interested in, "Our aim has been to carry on the signature themes that made Bloodlines unique, particularly its dark tone, atmosphere, and humor, and I think that fans of the original will love what we're doing with Bloodlines 2. This was the original story lead saying this, so it wasn't just hype, right? And now that the company had a big backer with Paradox, what could go wrong? promised mod support was to come, a kick-ass story. There was so much to like. It might sound like I'm hyping things up, but in the same announcement would be some impressions from IGN revealed as well. And they were stating that based on what I've seen so far, Bloodlines 2 is every bit the worthy follow-up it could be, while also having the potential to be an excellent take on the modern RPG. I'll look forward to seeing what else is revealed along the road to its release and how the community, new and old, reacts. Players would originally take control of a Thin Blood, an early power vampire who usually was killed or ignored by the more powerful clans since they were clanless, and would have the ability to pursue different vampire clans, which would come with them story and power benefits as well, featuring a first-person combat system where you actually did wield different melee weapons yourself like in the first game, you had backgrounds which helped dictate the story, and the game featured the classic noir-inspired Seattle, which had plenty of exaggerated heights and dark edges to really enunciate the feeling of a dark world filled with vampires. This version of the game would be later shown on in a released demo, and many would argue that it looked better than what became of the launch game, and looked more like a proper Bloodlines game than what we got in the end. There might be some fantasy renditions of how great this version actually is, especially since most of us never played it, but at the very least, it looked like Hardsuit Labs had the right idea and was trying to build a focused RPG VTM game like the first one was, with many ways to play the game and build your character. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 would face its first delay in the fall of 2019, referencing not wanting to repeat the actions of the first game, a game notoriously that launched too early, which really hurt its early reception. But this wouldn't be the only delay that the project would face, nor the only tribulation. The next year would come with another major delay, now promising to launch the following year instead. But this delay wasn't like the others. This delay would come with some major departures and a eventual changing of hands of development. Brian Minnesota and Kara Ellison would both depart the project, reportedly having been let go in a hasty, quick decision. The most bizarre part is reasons weren't really given as to why, at least not initially. Minnesota would later detail in a blog post that he was completely caught off guard and was not part of the discussions regarding a delay. Minnesota would also express that the franchise meant everything to him, and that he was devastated. The other two creatives involved in the pitching of the project would also depart, Cloney and Ellison both no longer being featured on the particular project or having departed altogether. This wasn't a good sign, because now you have essentially a new creative team being introduced and no idea if they're even qualified for writing in this given setting. We would later find out that HSL was shopped out due to budgeting and Paradox wanting to still ship the game without having to pay for the rest of it by them. Now, perhaps there were more reasons, but that's what we got. VTMB 2 would then be pushed to 2021. Things had gotten so bad before shopping for another developer reportedly, Paradox would instead consider shutting down development on the game altogether. Paradox, who owned 30% of Hardsuit Labs, was able to lift them off the project, which would result in their termination of their narrative team, of course, and replace them with another developer. Reasons for this, as I stated, being reportedly based on Paradox not feeling that HSL could finish the project without putting too much more money into it. That's how the Chinese Room, a British company actually based on a thought experiment, known for largely narrative walking simulator style games, would end up with the franchise. Their sort of games are the ones that you explore items of interest and then follow a rather linear story. This might sound like a strange shift, and it probably is, but two things were at play here. First, Dan Pinchbeck, who would lead the pitch for the game in studio, was essentially given leftover assets and gameplay elements from Hardsuit Labs and their version of the game, but would then go and completely rewrite the story and characters and writing. The Chinese Room then would work from there, telling Paradox outright that they couldn't do the open world game that Hardsuit Labs was working on, but could do a narrative-focused one instead, which is exactly what we got ultimately in the end. Dan Pinchbeck allegedly would repeatedly urge his team and Paradox to change the name of the game, feeling like they couldn't really deliver on the promise of an actual sequel. Besides just wanting to distance themselves by name, Dan seemed to not really understand the genius that was behind the IP that he pitched for in the first place, claiming that VTMB wouldn't work in a modern release setting, a bizarre claim to make with no evidence, and quite the contrary, and an even more bizarre claim to make when you're supposed to be making a sequel. This is the age of The Boys, their spin-off show, and tons of other actual vampire shows, edgy humor with superhuman people and the like. That's where the onus of the problem probably starts, because how can you have your creative lead not even understand or respect the game they were handling? It's honestly ridiculous. After delaying again and announcing a new developer in charge, Paradox would finally relent in the summer of 2023 and refund all pre-orders. Dan Pinchbeck, who was spearheading everything on the project, would suddenly leave in the summer of 2023, citing that he didn't like AAA development and he suffered from burnouts. The problem being Dan Pinchbeck's reason for redoing the game's narrative and characters was not wanting to finish someone else's vision and work, to which he would then not finish his own. What a strange creative, and I'm allowed to say that as one myself. But what I mean is creatives are usually driven by creativity and visions of creation. Did this guy even want to make a Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines game in the first place, or was he just trying to make a career move? I'm not really convinced. The Chinese room would be publicly announced as the new developer September 2nd, 2023, and it's here that you can see the trailers, visuals, and even characters change for the game, even receiving a completely new announcement trailer. Now, the Chinese room had talent. They had shipped a few adventure games that were well received, like Dear Esther, Everybody's Gone to Rapture, and of course the Amnesia series. But these games are more so about walking around and being unable to really defend yourself against elements that you're presented with, and more so having to avoid them. A very different narrative feeling to what Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines as a series was about, which was giving you, the player, the power to play the game however you wanted. The Chinese room would even admit this, basically, but they still took the job, which is why we can still hate them. Anyway, but to be fair, they had little support on their own. Having their own owner and master to serve, Sumo Digital, who would actually cut a lot of their team during the development of VTMB2, heavily hamstringing the team too. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 was somehow still active, and maybe that was the miracle in all of this. But what would it look like after being resurrected so many times by a costly blood magic? Just when things seemingly couldn't get any worse, the CEO behind Paradox, or Deputy CEO is what they were calling him, Matthias Lilja, would make some truly wild statements regarding the Vampire the Masquerade IP and even Bloodlines specifically. Lilja would admit it wasn't in their strategic direction to make a game like Bloodlines, which was a bizarre thing to say out loud even if it was true, and you just spent all this money on it. But that was coming largely from a strategy-focused game developer and publisher, so that was the context. Lilja wouldn't stop there either. While a CEO usually takes heat in a way to uplift their own product and kind of sniff their own farts, Lilja instead would just put more heat on the soon-to-launch Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, stating that the game and franchise was a dead end with desires to offload to other developers. Lilja would later clarify that they had trust in the soon-to-launch Bloodlines 2 and their developer, the Chinese room, as if anybody was really going to believe that after you just prefaced with all of that other shit. Paradox, in time for the Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 release, would resurrect the White Wolf tabletop RPG brand with promises of one other video game to accompany it as well. I wonder if it was Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 or maybe the other one we covered on our series. This would allow them to function as their own entity and show at the very least that Paradox hadn't fully given up on their World of Darkness acquisition and IP. The Chinese room, though, would face more layoffs in the summer of 2025, and this was more of the fall-off of their parent company Sumo Group deciding to focus on co-development work instead. But instead of backing down and just accepting things, the Chinese room would do what most either haven't or weren't able to do. They would become independent following a management buyout. This was impressive, but would sadly lead to more layoffs in the meantime. The Chinese room, seemingly in an attempt to maximize their revenue, whether through Paradox decision-making or strictly theirs, would announce that 2 of the clans that were going to be featured in the upcoming Bloodlines game would be hidden behind a paywall. They would even defend the initial pushback on this, but within a few months would change their minds and remove the DLC clans. For me, this was just calculated risk management, waiting to see how bad the pushback would be. But the idea that you now suddenly had 2 payworthy classes, or clans, and the others weren't, was a bad omen of things to come. Worse, although the Malkavia were highly advertised, whether as an actual clan or some, main character showcase, they were not even a playable clan in the game, being an absolute fan favorite. Vampire the Masquerade without Malkavia is like the Lord of the Rings without the dwarves. Sure, they're not the biggest characters, but their impact is always noticed and felt. And the Malkavia characters they introduce is in your head, Fabian. This character serves as a constant voice in your head, a tutorial voice even, constantly telling you where to go and what to do. The actual Malkavian-ness has been mostly muted or removed, with Fabian largely sounding like a character straight from a crime drama, which is a disappointment because he acts like your dad. But we will talk more about the character shortly. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 would launch on PC and console October 21st, 2025 after nearly 10 years of cooking. What we got in the end wasn't really even close to what we had expected. VTMB2 would score 62 out of 100 on aggregate review website Metacritic from 40 different critics, while scoring an even more terrible user rating at 4.7 out of 10 and then 3 out of 5 on Steam. According to IGN, the game was flawed and had plenty to love and loathe alike. They would then rate the game bizarrely a 7 out of 10, despite such a review, where they would claim ultimately to have a love and hate relationship with the game. Their conclusions aren't the least bit convincing to me, as they state the game seems to follow the world's lore properly. It didn't, and I will explain after another critical review. Eurogamer would have a much more sobering review, where they would acknowledge the game at the very least plays to the strengths of the Chinese room. It's just that those strengths, like the scenes where you play as Fabian and like the flashbacks, don't really help them in this case, because they're pretty boring and you can't really skip any of them. It also just showcases the rest of the game's shortcomings. Eurogamer would then defend the game's obvious move towards more action with things like bad character creation, really as you can just pick only a few options, some of which were actually added post-launch. But as long as the action was worth it, they stated. But I think that's missing the point, and I will explain why. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, the first one, might feel like something you can just borrow elements from and then kind of like move on. But there's never been a successful sequel to a game that was built on not learning how to take main elements of the first game and bring them into the second game and obviously evolve them. VTMB 1's combat is not that great. Wow, surprise. So maybe there was an upgrade here for them. But regarding like when compared to other industry competitors, even older titles like Dying Light and Left 4 Dead or even the more RPG-esque titles, VTMB 2's combat doesn't feel like that much of an upgrade. The best thing the game has is the visuals, like the very pretty and haunting Seattle and a really fun and cool parkour system to explore it with. But there's nothing to really explore. So the parkour system, much like Seattle's visuals and set-piece look, are really nothing more than just like window dressing without actually leading to emergent or interactive gameplay that's fun or impactful. It feels like if VTMB 1 was rough around the edges, but had this like deep complexity and love, then VTMB 2 was like a puddle deep thing that looked and played more like a snow globe than a proper RPG. What I mean is that snow globes, they're pretty and festive. But besides shaking things up a little and just looking at it kind of fall to the ground, there's not much there, you know? That was the sort of game that the Chinese room liked to make, and to be honest, some of the games they made are pretty fun and good, but they aren't a Vampire the Masquerade game. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines was about interactivity. It was about really affecting your environment and world through your decisions and actions throughout the game. An interactive narrative game could work if it wasn't so railroaded like it was in VTMB 2, where even the multi-level endings almost all just feel like the same versions of each other, making your decisions throughout the game feel weightless and pointless. Compare this to the first game where picking a Nosferatu literally completely changed the gameplay, where NPCs wouldn't talk to you because you were so grotesque looking, and you were forced to live in the sewers.
And you, my fugly friend, are gonna have it extra hard. A little effort and the rest of us can blend in okay. A sighting of your hideous ass hits the internet and it's all over.
Now we have Nosferatu and Tali, just hanging out and being festive and metrosexual, or gay. I couldn't tell.
Damn, kid! You're not new to chewing your way through the hordes, are you? Name's Michael Tolliver, but call me Tolly. I'm your go-to gal for fun times at the OK Camarilla.
Nor did I care, making a mockery of the entire clan itself. And no, that's not a sexuality reference, or because the twang in their voice. It's because Nosferatu being so good socially doesn't make lore sense, because they wouldn't even get the chance to become that charismatic. The dialogue overall is obviously a step down too, in many cases. With the main character, for example, remarking about social media despite being a multi-century old vampire who was just awoken. Worse, stat checks from the first game are gone in this game. So even if you got the chance to talk to someone, all the subtlety and beauty of the first game's writing and dialogue was sort of lacking. Even down to how the facial animations work for the characters, and once you notice it, it's hard not to notice it. Like other reviewers have pointed out, the characters have almost no expression to them. Compare that to a game that was 20 years older, and it's not even competitive. And even if you want to move past that point, Tali, going back to him, should have some sort of impact and weight in the world, where people are still mocking him, and you have to kind of like defend him or not, despite wanting to be normal and part of the crew. The lore in VTMB just feels so plastic, and like they don't even consider it seriously themselves. And where they could shine, like the Malkavian living in your brain, it ends up feeling like a grandpa lecturing you a lot of the time, where it could have been like the cooler Navi moment. The final nail in the coffin, if you will, for me is that Fire, the vampire you play as, which I guess is ironic because they don't like fire, as the main character is actually an elder vampire. This is a 6th to 7th level generation vampire. Something that's impressive because being a thin blood vampire is difficult to make a mark as, and it takes you literally centuries to accrue power, and good luck not dying in the process to that. Think about it. Prince Sebastian Lacroix from the first game, and I don't know if I butchered his name, sorry about my French, was 2 generations or so higher than you were in the game, and he was immensely powerful. The point being, why is an elder vampire doing fetch quests? And why am I even worrying about the enemies around me and having to go through like pseudo progression? I should already be pretty progressed and pretty powerful. This is a shame because apparently in the original HSL version, you played as a thin blood, a clanless, weak vampire, trying to choose what clan they wanted to join and then accrue power with. Closer to how the first game was, of course. The reason doing an elder storyline is more difficult is that you basically have to be an overpowered character for it to make sense. There's not much growth or climbing up from the bottom. Look at the intro of Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. It starts after you're turned. It's one of the most explosive intros in an RPG I've ever experienced. Compare this to the second game and it feels so tepid by comparison. It's not nearly as gripping. Worse, the game just feels so sanitized, which is not what players want when they're playing a Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines game. They want things to feel raunchy, dark, mysterious, maybe even creepy. Vampire the Masquerade 2 feels more like dark, empty, and guiding? With that ever-guiding scent thing that you can just follow around that tells you everything to do if you're not already being told what to do by Fabian, the voice in your head. It just feels like this is like the one franchise, if there's a few more, that people didn't want hand-holding with, and yet that's pretty much all the game is. The first major patch would also announce an upcoming content roadmap with some additions meant to improve the game, like an FOV slider, a motion blur toggle, save on exit, custom difficulties, you know, the things that most games already have. But with 2026, some major updates were planned, alongside some content updates, so perhaps things would eventually improve for the struggling title, which seemingly sold less than 200,000 copies just like the first game struggled and sold poorly at launch. But was the passion there, whether from the developers or the community, to keep going? I had my doubts. After VTMB 2 would flop commercially, as I stated already, reportedly making only about like 3.4 million. Paradox would have to write down in the tone of 37 million, meaning that the game was likely in the 40 million budget range and a massive blunder for Paradox. These missed targets for Paradox would mean that besides the already planned content to come out, we weren't likely to see much more content come, and worse, we weren't going to see the game make a comeback because the Chinese room wasn't fully invested in the product and probably couldn't be. Suddenly the game that seemed so easy to beat up on, and everyone did their share at that, having had a similar launch itself, seems less so. Suddenly, VTMB 1 looks much better off than the second game, and it's there you make a realization that sometimes something fails commercially, but succeeds critically, or with fans of the series. Office Space was a critical snoozer until it hit DVD and blew up the world with corny office jokes, and I'm a fan. Just make sure not to steal my stapler. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines was the same. It formed its fan base through earth and fire. Whatever fan base was there wasn't by force, and was choosing to be a fan of the once troubled game and, well, series. With VTMB 2, when you don't even have fans rallying around a game, broken or not, it's a sign that the art is missing, and not very good. And in the end, are you really surprised? You have a title that was hyped for nearly a decade that had publishers with cold feet at the last second switch hands of development, arguably to a less qualified team, and the manufactured result is a sequel that feels barely like the first game and plays barely better than it only in certain aspects. That's the other kicker really, or the final sin, if you will. VTMB 1 was controversial even before it was patched. VTMB 2 was controversial because it was painfully overhyped and an average game. There's a difference. The music is playing detectives and the timeline has come to an end. That means that we have gathered enough clues to put the case to rest for good. But in case you missed any of the clues along the way, why did VTMB 2 fail so epically and find itself in the Death of the Game series despite being a single-player game? Well, it wasn't a true successor. It was a mid-game outside the whole Vampire the Masquerade name. Worse than the previous VTMB game. It missed the essence of what it meant to be a Vampire the Masquerade game. It was stuck in development hell. The project had two versions, and a worse one, arguably, became the one that was ultimately chosen. Poor IP management and employee handling from higher-ups. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodline, I have already summoned a few fledgling vampires to start playing again, choosing one of the better decisions in their life, if I might say so myself, especially gaming-wise. Hell, making this video made me want to go play it myself. That's what a good game does. No, a great game. A legendary one. A legendary game doesn't pay heed to commercial success as much as it does to focus on capturing the hearts of many. And if you check the comments below, you will see that Vampire the Masquerade and WOD as a world has captured the hearts of many despite having such a rocky history as an IP. But Bloodlines 2 I don't think will be remembered for anything more than just a cautionary tale. If you take the superfans and developers off of a game and their own beloved IP, you can't be sure how the new caretakers will care for things. Especially when the CEO of everything was basically calling the series a wet noodle. Yeah, maybe don't do that in the future. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next case. It's one for some reason that people thought I wouldn't cover. You don't know me. Meanwhile, I'm chomping at the bit. See you at the next case.